In 2019, a man walked into an exotic car rental counter, put down a deposit on a Lamborghini Huracán for a single weekend, and then just didn't bring it back. Not for a long weekend, not for a month. He drove that car for over 2 years, racked up more than $200,000 in unpaid charges, crossed state lines multiple times, and ended up on a felony warrant list in 3 different jurisdictions, all because he kept telling himself he'd return it next week, and next week never came. Welcome to Catastrophe Theory, where we figure out exactly how fast your life falls apart if you actually let the intrusive thoughts win. I'm CJ Theory, and today we're looking at what happens when you just keep the rental. When that little voice says, "What if I just didn't bring it back?" and instead of laughing it off in the parking lot, you actually listen. You are standing in the garage of an exotic car rental agency, and the air smells like leather conditioner and fresh tire rubber. The attendant hands you a key fob that weighs almost nothing but feels like it's made of something more expensive than the metal it's built from. In front of you sits a car that costs more than most people's houses. A Lamborghini, a Ferrari, a Rolls-Royce, doesn't matter which, they're all cut from the same fantasy. You slide into a seat that hugs you like it's been waiting for you specifically. The engine turns over with a sound that isn't really a sound so much as a physical sensation, something you feel in your sternum before you register it in your ears. You pull out onto the street, and for a few hours or a few days, you are someone else. Someone whose life includes cars like this as a matter of course. Maybe it's a weekend trip. Maybe it's a wedding, or an anniversary, or just a Tuesday where you needed to feel like your life was going somewhere other than where it actually was. You post a photo, somebody comments something like, "Must be nice," and for a few days, it is. The car becomes part of how you move through the world, the way people glance twice in a parking lot, the way a valet's posture slightly changes when you hand over the key, the small, quiet performance of a life that isn't quite yours, but fits, for now, disturbingly well. And somewhere in that fantasy, quietly, almost as a joke you tell yourself in the shower, a thought creeps in. What if I just kept it? What if the return date came and went and I just didn't show up? What would actually happen? Would anyone even notice right away? Could you disappear into a life where this car was simply yours for as long as you wanted it to be? It's such a small thought at first. It doesn't even feel like a decision. It feels like a daydream, the kind you have about quitting your job in the middle of a bad meeting or moving to another country on a whim. Harmless, because you'd never actually do it, except this is the one intrusive thought in this series that has an ignition switch already in your hand. I want to be upfront about something before we go further. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a repo agent, though I've spent enough time around both worlds researching cases like this that I probably owe them both a drink. I've spent years digging through court records, skip-tracing case files, and insurance fraud investigations, specifically the ones involving high-value vehicles, because there's something uniquely fascinating about watching a rational person make an irrational decision one day at a time. Nobody wakes up and decides to commit grand theft auto. They wake up, realize the return date passed yesterday, and decide that today isn't a good day to deal with it either. That's how nearly every case like this actually starts, not with a plan, with a delay. What strikes me most going through case after case of this exact scenario is how boringly similar the psychology is every single time. It's never a criminal mastermind plotting an elaborate scheme. It's someone who is already stressed about money, who took the rental partly to feel good for a weekend, who then felt a fresh wave of shame at the idea of walking back into that showroom and admitting the good weekend was over and the credit card was already stretched thin. So they don't call. They tell themselves they'll call tomorrow. And tomorrow the shame is bigger because now there's an extra day of silence sitting on top of it. That's the actual mechanism driving most of these cases, not greed, but avoidance. Compounding daily like interest on a debt nobody wants to look at directly. So let's actually break down what happens mechanically, legally, and financially when someone stops returning a rented luxury car, because the reality is stranger, faster, and in some ways scarier than most people assume. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why that intrusive thought is one of the worst ideas your brain has ever handed you. Let's start with the part almost nobody thinks about in the moment. The car is not just a car, it's a data-generating asset with a corporate entity, an insurance policy, and in most cases, a finance company, all watching it in real time, whether you remember that or not. Think about it this way for a second. When you rent a compact sedan from an ordinary lot, the company's exposure is modest, and the systems built around monitoring that car are correspondingly relaxed. But exotic and luxury rental companies operate on razor-thin margins with extraordinarily high per-unit risk. A single vehicle can represent a meaningful fraction of the company's entire fleet value. That risk profile changes everything about how these businesses are built from the ground up. They don't just insure the vehicle, they build entire risk management departments around it, staffed by people whose full-time job is watching dashboards that track every car in the fleet all day, every day, the way an air traffic controller watches a runway. You're not renting from a business that hopes for the best. You're renting from a business that has already modeled in exhaustive detail every version of what happens if this customer doesn't come back, because you are statistically not the first person to have that daydream. Part 1 is what I call the grace period, and it's shorter than you think. Most exotic and luxury rental agencies build a small buffer into their systems, anywhere from a few hours to a couple of days past the return time, because rental returns are messy in the real world. Traffic happens, flights get delayed, people genuinely lose track of time. So in the first few hours after your return window closes, almost nothing dramatic happens. You might get an automated text, you might get a call that goes to voicemail. The company at this stage is operating under the assumption of good faith, because statistically, the overwhelming majority of late returns are exactly that, late, not stolen. There's a specific internal term a lot of these companies use for this window, something along the lines of soft overdue status, and it exists specifically because the industry has learned, the expensive way, that treating every late return as an emergency burns out staff and damages customer relationships over what's usually just a missed flight or a bad case of procrastination. So the first call you get, if you get one at all, is almost always polite, almost apologetic even. Hey, just following up, we show the vehicle's still out, wanted to check if everything's okay. That politeness is doing a lot of work. It's the company extending you the benefit of the doubt one more time, and how you respond to that one phone call, whether you pick up, whether you're honest, whether you propose a real plan, genuinely determines which version of the next several weeks you're about to live through. But here's the part that catches people off guard. While that grace period is unfolding on the human side, the technical side never stops. Nearly every high-value rental vehicle built in the last decade comes factory-equipped with GPS telemetry, and rental agencies almost universally activate and monitor it, specifically because the vehicles are expensive enough to justify the tracking infrastructure. This isn't a secret aftermarket tracker hidden under the seat, like something out of a heist movie. It's baked into the car's own systems, reporting location, sometimes speed, sometimes even fuel level, back to a dashboard the rental company is watching. So from the very first hour past your due date, someone, somewhere, already knows exactly where that car is. The only question left is how long it takes them to act on that information. And that's the first cliffhanger of this whole situation, isn't it? Because the countdown that actually matters isn't the one you can see, it's the one running quietly on a server in an office you'll never visit, operated by people whose entire job is figuring out exactly when late becomes something else entirely. So what does that countdown actually look like from the inside? What flips a company from patient to alarmed, and how much runway do you actually have before that switch gets flipped? That's exactly where we're headed next. Part 2 begins somewhere around the 24 to 72 hour mark, and this is where things stop being administrative and start being financial. Most luxury rental agreements include what's called a hold, an authorization on your credit card for a sum well beyond the daily rental rate, sometimes 5 figures, specifically to cover exactly this scenario. Once you're overdue, that hold doesn't just sit there. Agencies typically begin charging the daily rate plus a late fee, plus, in many contracts, a separate, much steeper unauthorized use rate that can run 2 to 5 times the normal daily price. This isn't punitive cruelty, it's contractual design, built by lawyers who have seen this exact situation play out hundreds of times before you ever sat in that driver's seat. Your card gets charged again and again, whether or not you're checking your statements. Somewhere in this window, most people who let the intrusive thought win start to feel the first real wave of dread, not because someone showed up at their door, but because their banking app just showed them a number they weren't prepared for. Do the math with me for a second, because the pacing of this is what really catches people off guard. A high-end exotic might run somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 a day at the standard rate. Bump that into the unauthorized use multiplier once you're past your window, and you're looking at $3,000 to $8,000 a day, accumulating silently whether you're thinking about the car or not. A single missed week, 1 week, 7 days, the kind of stretch that feels like nothing when you're avoiding a phone call, can translate into tens of thousands of dollars in charges before you've even had your first real conversation with anyone at the company. This is the part of the fantasy that the fantasy conveniently leaves out. The car doesn't feel any different to drive on day 9 than it did on day 1. The bill absolutely does. At the same time, something quieter and more consequential is happening behind the scenes. The rental agreement you signed, the one you skimmed past the fine print on to get to the keys faster, almost certainly contains language that voids the insurance coverage the moment the agreed return period lapses without an approved extension. That means, from roughly this point forward, if you get into an accident, if the car gets stolen from you, if it gets damaged in any way, you are very likely financially exposed for the entire value of the vehicle, not the daily rate, not a deductible, the entire replacement value of a car that can run anywhere from $80,000 to well over $250,000 sitting on your shoulders alone, uninsured the moment you drove past the point of no return. Think about the strange asymmetry there for a second. The company's own commercial insurance protects the vehicle for exactly as long as the rental agreement says it should be in your hands. The instant that window closes, that protection doesn't fade out gradually. It drops off a cliff immediately and completely, and your personal auto policy, if you even have one, almost certainly excludes coverage on a rented vehicle you're now operating outside the terms of its rental agreement, because insurers write those exclusions specifically to avoid subsidizing exactly this scenario. So the version of events people picture, worst case I total it and insurance handles it, was never actually on the table past this point. You're not driving a rental car insurance-wise. You're driving a $200,000 liability with your name on every piece of paperwork attached to it. Which raises the question a lot of people don't think to ask until it's too late. If the insurance dies quietly in the background the second the return window closes, how much of the risk you thought you were taking on were you actually taking on this entire time? And if the financial exposure is already that severe before anyone's even called the police, you have to wonder what's actually left standing between a bad decision and a genuine criminal record. That's where things start to shift into a different category entirely. Part 3 is where this stops being a rental dispute and starts being something with a very different name attached to it. This is the part that surprises people the most, because there's a persistent myth that keeping a rental car past its due date is purely a civil matter, something between a company's legal department and maybe a stern letter, and for the first stretch of time, that's often true. But most jurisdictions have specific statutes covering exactly this scenario, sometimes labeled as theft of leased or rented property, and the legal threshold that flips a late return into a criminal one usually hinges on 2 things: how much time has passed, and whether the renter has made any good faith attempt to communicate. It's worth understanding why lawmakers even bothered writing statutes this specific. Rental and leasing industries lobbied hard for these laws decades ago, back when equipment and vehicle rental was becoming a much larger part of the economy, precisely because ordinary theft statutes weren't a clean fit for this situation. Ordinary theft usually requires proving the person intended to steal the property from the very beginning, at the moment they took possession of it, which is a genuinely difficult thing to prove when someone walked in, signed a legitimate contract, and drove off with full permission. So legislators built a separate category, one that doesn't require proving intent at the very start, only that the person failed to return the property after being given clear, documented notice to do so. It's a lower bar for prosecutors to clear, specifically because this exact pattern, good intentions at the start, avoidance in the middle, silence at the end, turned out to be so common that generic theft law simply wasn't equipped to handle it. Here's the mechanism, and it's worth understanding because it's almost elegant in how deliberately it's built. Rental companies, before they ever call the police, typically send what's called a demand letter, a formal, often certified, written request for the immediate return of the vehicle, laying out a specific deadline, frequently 48 to 72 hours. This letter isn't just a formality, it's the company building a legal record, a paper trail that says unambiguously, "We told you," in writing, and gave you a clear window to comply. If that deadline passes with no response and no returned vehicle, the company can then file a police report alleging that the vehicle is being unlawfully retained. And in many states, that's enough to trigger an actual criminal investigation, not just a debt collection process. I want you to picture the actual physical object here for a second because I think it helps make the abstraction land. It's a plain envelope, certified mail, the kind with a green card you have to sign for, which is itself a quietly brilliant piece of legal design, because the moment you sign that card, the company now has physical, undeniable proof that the letter reached you personally. No claiming later that it got lost, that you never saw it, that your mailbox was broken. Your own signature becomes the government's proof that the clock started ticking. Some people, once they realize what's in the envelope, simply refuse to sign for it, thinking that avoids the notice entirely. It doesn't. Most jurisdictions treat a documented delivery attempt, refused or not, as sufficient notice on its own, because the law generally doesn't reward people for actively dodging information they know is coming. The legal reasoning here is genuinely interesting if you sit with it for a second. Contract law generally assumes both parties are negotiating in reasonably good faith, and breach of contract is handled through civil remedies, lawsuits, judgments, garnishments. But once a company can demonstrate that you were formally notified, in writing, with a clear deadline, and you still didn't return the property or attempt a negotiation for an extension, the law in many places allows prosecutors to argue that your continued possession has crossed from breach of contract into wrongful taking, which is a much older, much blunter legal concept, the same one that covers stealing a bicycle off someone's porch, just wearing a much more expensive disguise. It's a strange thing to sit with, honestly, the idea that the exact same set of facts, the exact same person, the exact same car can occupy two entirely different legal universes depending purely on a calendar and a piece of paper. On day 2, you're a customer with an overdue balance. On day 9, after a certified letter and a missed deadline, you might legally be a defendant in a criminal proceeding, even though you never once got behind the wheel with any intention other than driving home from a nice weekend. The law doesn't care what you meant to do on day 1. It cares what you actually did on every day after you were formally told to stop. And once that threshold gets crossed, the entire tone of the situation changes. You're no longer dealing with a company's collections department. You're dealing with law enforcement, and specifically, in a lot of these cases, you're dealing with GPS coordinates that have been quietly logging your exact location this entire time. And that's really the part worth sitting with before we go any further, because up to this point, every single consequence has been avoidable with one phone call. A phone call is free. A criminal referral is not. So why does anyone actually let it get this far when the exit door was open the entire time? Which brings us to part 4, the part people picture when they imagine this scenario, and the part that almost never looks the way they picture it. There's no dramatic car chase in the overwhelming majority of these cases. What actually happens is far quieter, and honestly, far more unsettling once you understand it. Rental companies dealing with an unreturned high-value vehicle typically don't call for a SWAT team. They call a repossession agent, or in some cases, they hand the GPS data directly to police, who then locate the vehicle, parked outside a home, sitting in a grocery store lot, idling at a gas station, either recover it directly or coordinate an arrest at a moment of their choosing, often when the renter least expects it, because surprise reduces the risk of the vehicle being moved or hidden again. Repossession agents working high-value vehicle cases operate almost nothing like the popular image of the job. It's rarely a tow truck showing up loudly in the middle of the afternoon. More often, it's someone parked quietly down the street for an hour, watching, confirming the vehicle is unattended, sometimes waiting until the middle of the night specifically because that minimizes confrontation risk for everyone involved, themselves included. Many jurisdictions actually restrict how repossessions can legally occur. No breach of the peace, no forced entry into a locked garage, no physical confrontation, which means the agent's entire skill set is really about patience and timing rather than force. The car you've been quietly, anxiously watching out your window for days, wondering if today's the day, might get recovered on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning while you're asleep, and you may not even know it's gone until you walk outside the next day and the space where it was parked is simply empty. This is the part of the story that should genuinely reframe how you think about the whole scenario. From the very first hour that car went unreturned, its location was never actually a secret. The entire time you might have been telling yourself you were buying space to figure things out, the car itself was quietly broadcasting exactly where figuring things out was happening. The Lamborghini driver from our opening statistic wasn't caught because of some brilliant detective work. He was caught because a 2-year-old GPS ping eventually crossed paths with a routine license plate scan. And once that happened, the location data that had been sitting there patiently the entire time did the rest of the work in minutes. So here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If the car has been telling on you this whole time, what exactly do you think you were hiding, and from whom? Part 5 is the part that outlasts everything else, because even once the car is recovered, the story isn't over. This is the financial sinkhole, and it's usually far deeper than people expect. Rental companies don't just want their car back, they pursue what's called a loss of use claim, essentially billing you for every day the vehicle wasn't available to rent to someone else at the full daily rate, sometimes for the entire duration you had it, sometimes with additional penalty multipliers baked into the original contract. On top of that, there's frequently a diminished value claim, because a car that's been driven several thousand extra miles by an unauthorized, uninsured driver is worth measurably less on resale than it was the day it left the lot, and companies routinely bill renters for that difference. Add in the accumulated daily overage charges from Part 2, add in any actual damage the vehicle sustained, add in legal fees for pursuing the claim, and you're often looking at a final bill that can run into 6 figures attached to a name that now has a very different relationship with credit reporting agencies, collections firms, and potentially, depending on how the criminal side played out, a permanent record. There's a particular cruelty to how this debt behaves once it exists, and it's worth naming directly. Unlike a lot of consumer debt, a judgment tied to a theft-adjacent claim often doesn't get treated gently by courts because the underlying conduct isn't seen as an unfortunate financial hardship, it's seen as a knowing violation of a clear agreement. That can affect everything from whether the debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy down the line, to how aggressively a collections firm is willing to pursue wage garnishment, to how a judge weighs your credibility if this ever intersects with an unrelated legal matter years later. Debt from an unpaid medical bill and debt from an unreturned Ferrari do not, generally speaking, get treated the same way by the systems built to collect them. And that's before we even get to what a felony theft charge does to employment prospects, professional licensing, immigration status for non-citizens, or the simple, exhausting reality of explaining to every future landlord and employer why there's a gap or a flag on your background check. So let's pause here because I think it's worth being honest about something. This entire video started with an intrusive thought. What if I just kept it? And I want to validate that the thought itself isn't strange or shameful. Standing next to something that beautiful, something that expensive, something that makes you feel like a different version of yourself, it's completely human to wonder what would happen if the fantasy didn't have to end on schedule. The problem was never the thought. The problem is what happens if you stop treating it like a thought and start treating it like a plan. Let's clear up a few things people consistently get wrong about this whole scenario, because the myths here are doing a lot of damage. Myth 1. It's just a civil matter, so worst case they sue me and I pay it off slowly. Reality, as we covered, most jurisdictions allow this to escalate into a criminal charge once a formal demand has been made and ignored, and once police are involved, this stops being something you can negotiate your way out of with a payment plan. Why it's false? People conflate started as a rental agreement with will always be treated as a rental agreement, but the law cares about your conduct after the fact far more than the paperwork you signed at the start. Myth 2. If I just avoid using the GPS-connected features or park it somewhere out of the way, they can't find it. Reality, as we discussed, the tracking is built into the vehicle's core systems in most modern luxury cars, not an optional feature you can simply disable, and rental companies specifically choose vehicles and telemetry providers built for exactly this kind of monitoring. Why it's false? People imagine tracking the way movies portray it, a single removable device you can find and destroy, when in reality it's integrated into systems most renters don't have the technical access or knowledge to fully disable, and attempting to tamper with it can become an additional charge. Myth 3. If I keep making payments, even late ones, that proves I'm not stealing it, so I'm safe. Reality, partial payment can sometimes help your case in showing intent, but it does not automatically prevent criminal charges, especially once a formal demand for the vehicle's return has been issued and ignored. And legally, the question isn't primarily are you paying, it's are you unlawfully retaining property that isn't yours after being asked to return it, and money changing hands doesn't automatically resolve that question on its own. Myth 4. If I rented it under someone else's name or card, I'm personally protected either way. Reality, this typically makes things worse, not better, because it can introduce fraud or identity-related charges on top of the underlying theft allegation. And it also means a second person now has legal and financial exposure they may not have agreed to. Why it's false? Rental agreements are contracts tied to a specific signer, and involving someone else's identity without their full informed consent doesn't create a buffer, it creates an additional victim and an additional charge. Myth 5, and this one comes up more than you'd think. If the company hasn't contacted me in a while, maybe they've written it off and moved on. Reality, silence from the company is almost never a sign of them giving up. It's far more often a sign that the file has already been escalated internally, handed off from the friendly customer service team to a legal or recovery department that doesn't call to chat, it calls once it's ready to act. Businesses built around high-value assets do not casually absorb 5- or 6-figure losses. The absence of a phone call usually means the phase of the process where phone calls happen has already ended, and the next contact you get may not come from the company at all. Now here's where we shift from fear to agency, because understanding the mechanics of a disaster is only useful if it actually changes what you do differently. If you ever find yourself past a rental return date, whether it's a luxury exotic or an everyday sedan, here's the actual framework for getting out of it cleanly instead of deeper. 1. The moment you realize you're going to be late, even by a few hours, call the rental company immediately. Almost every agency has a formal extension process, and using it costs you a conversation and possibly an extra day's fee. Not using it costs you your entire legal standing in every scenario we just walked through.
2. Get any extension in writing. A verbal, "yeah, that's fine," from someone on a phone line means nothing if it's ever disputed later. An email confirmation is the difference between a documented agreement and a case built entirely on your word against theirs. 3. If you've missed the window entirely and haven't called yet, call now, today, before you finish watching this video. Every hour that passes without contact is an hour that strengthens the case that this is intentional retention rather than an honest delay. 4. Do not move the vehicle to a new city or state hoping to figure things out from a safer distance. As we've covered, the location data makes this pointless, and crossing jurisdictional lines with a vehicle under dispute can add additional charges layered directly on top of the original ones. 5. If a demand letter arrives, do not ignore it, and do not assume silence works in your favor. Respond in writing. Even if the response is simply, "I need to arrange transportation to return the vehicle. Can we set a specific date?" A documented good faith effort is the single strongest tool you have if this situation ever needs to be explained to a prosecutor or a judge. 6. If you genuinely cannot afford the accumulating charges, say so directly to the company in writing and ask about a payment arrangement before returning the vehicle rather than after avoiding the conversation entirely. Companies overwhelmingly prefer getting their asset back intact and negotiating the financial side afterward over chasing down a vehicle that's actively depreciating and accumulating risk the longer it's gone. Most rental businesses would genuinely rather write off a part of a bill in exchange for a cooperative customer than spend money on recovery agents, legal fees, and a depreciated vehicle that comes back scuffed and over mileage weeks later. You have more leverage in that conversation than the dread in your stomach is telling you. 7. Arrange the actual logistics of returning it properly rather than just abandoning it somewhere convenient. Leaving a rented exotic car in an airport lot with the keys under the mat doesn't count as a return and can itself be treated as an additional act of irresponsible or even criminal handling of someone else's property. Call the company, ask exactly where and how they want it brought back, and get a confirmation, ideally in writing, that they've received it and the file is closed. 8. If things have already escalated to the point of a police report or formal legal notice, contact an attorney before you contact the rental company again. This isn't about hiding anything. It's about making sure any further communication is handled in a way that protects you, especially in a scenario where the line between civil and criminal liability has already started blurring. 9. Understand that returning the vehicle late, on your own initiative before any police report exists, is treated dramatically differently under the law than having it recovered by a repossession agent or an officer. Voluntary return, even embarrassingly late, is powerful evidence against any argument that you intended to permanently deprive the owner of their property, which is often the exact legal element separating a civil dispute from a criminal one. 10. Keep every piece of communication, every text, every email, every voicemail transcript, even the ones that make you look bad in the moment. It feels counterintuitive to preserve evidence of your own delay, but a documented timeline showing genuine, if slow, good faith effort is worth far more to your defense than silence ever could be, because silence is the one thing that can't be explained away later. 11. And if you're watching this because you're currently, right now, sitting in a car you know you should have returned days ago, return it today. Not tomorrow, not once you've mentally prepared yourself, not once you've figured out the perfect explanation. Every additional day is doing measurable, compounding damage to your legal position, your credit, and your future options. And none of that damage undoes itself just because you eventually bring the car back.
I want to end this the way I try to end most of these videos because I think it matters more than the checklist does. The entire luxury rental industry, and honestly the entire concept of renting anything at all, is built on something that's genuinely remarkable if you step back and actually look at it. A system where a stranger hands another stranger the keys to something worth more than most people's annual salary, based almost entirely on a signature, a credit card, and a shared assumption that both parties are going to honor an agreement neither of them is forced into. That's not a small thing. That's an enormous, quietly functioning miracle of mutual trust, repeated thousands of times a day all over the world, almost never making the news precisely because it almost always works exactly as intended. Consider how strange that actually is, historically speaking. For most of human history, lending something this valuable to a stranger would have been unthinkable without collateral, without a personal relationship, without some kind of enforceable social bond holding the arrangement together. What we've built instead, quietly over the last century, is a system that replaces personal trust with institutional trust. Credit scores, standardized contracts, insurance underwriting, telemetry systems, layers of infrastructure that let two people who will never actually get to know each other exchange something enormously valuable and overwhelmingly get it back safely on both ends. Every time you rent a car, an apartment, a tool, a tuxedo, you're participating in one of the quieter triumphs of modern life, and it's easy to forget that triumph exists specifically because almost everyone, almost all the time, quietly upholds their end of it without a second thought. The entire fear underneath this video isn't really about cars. It's about what happens when we test the edges of systems that depend on us behaving the way we said we would. And I think that fear is worth sitting with honestly rather than dismissing, because it's the same fear that shows up anywhere trust and consequence intersect. A library book kept too long, a borrowed tool never returned, a favor that quietly curled into an obligation nobody wants to name out loud. The luxury car version just happens to come with GPS tracking, felony statutes, and a bill with more zeros on it than most of us will ever comfortably explain to a judge. The fear underneath this whole video isn't really about cars. It's about what happens when we test the edges of systems that depend on us behaving the way we said we would. And I think that fear is worth sitting with honestly rather than dismissing, because it's the same fear that shows up anywhere trust and consequence intersect. A library book kept too long, a borrowed tool never returned, a favor that quietly curdled into an obligation nobody wants to name out loud. The luxury car version just happens to come with GPS tracking, felony statutes, and a bill with more zeros on it than most of us will ever comfortably explain to a judge. There's something almost tender, honestly, in recognizing that the daydream itself was never the problem. Wanting for a weekend to feel like a different version of yourself, wealthier, freer, less burdened by whatever's actually sitting in your bank account, that's about as universally human as it gets. The fantasy isn't a character flaw, it's just a fantasy. The same species of thought as imagining you moved to another country, or quit your job, or told your boss exactly what you actually think in that meeting. Almost nobody acts on those thoughts, and the vast, overwhelming majority of people who rent an exotic car for a weekend return it exactly on schedule, tired, a little poorer, thoroughly satisfied, and completely unremarkable in the eyes of the system they just briefly borrowed from. The story we've spent the last several minutes on is the rare exception, not the rule, but it's the exception that teaches you the most about how the rule actually works underneath. So if you ever find yourself standing in that garage again, hand on a key fob that feels like it belongs to someone else's life, and that intrusive thought whispers up from somewhere in the back of your mind, what if I just didn't bring it back? I want you to actually let yourself acknowledge it, not suppress it, not panic about having thought it at all. Just notice it, the way you'd notice any other passing impulse, and then let it pass, the same way you'd let go of any other thought that would cost you everything to actually act on. Return the car. Enjoy the 4 days you had it. Let the fantasy end exactly where it was supposed to, and walk back into your actual, ordinary, wonderfully unfelonious life. There's a particular kind of peace in an uneventful Monday morning. Keys already returned, no certified letters waiting in your mailbox, no quiet blinking dot on a stranger's dashboard tracking exactly where you are. And once you understand everything that Monday morning was actually protecting you from, it starts to feel less like an ordinary day and a little more like a small, quiet miracle you got to walk right past without even noticing. But that's just a theory, a catastrophe theory. Thanks for not ruining your life.